Hi, in this video I'm going to cover the forecast sheet feature in Excel. Let's paint some scenarios. Say for example, you're a student, you got some homework to do, and what you're trying to do is forecast the population into the next decade to figure out how it will impact resources. You're going to write a paper about it. Or maybe you're a salesperson and you're wondering when you should start promoting the next Christmas sales tree event. Well, this can all be done quite easily by using the forecast sheet feature in Excel. And it's pretty easy to do. You don't really have to write any fancy functions. You just let Excel do it all for you, and it'll even create a chart. So let's see how we can do this. All we need to do is go under Data, go to the forecast sheet feature, which is available starting in Excel 2016, and click it. We will get the dialog box here, and we can see it's already created a chart for us. Now, there's two charts that are available here. There's the line chart, and then there is the column chart. And you can see there these little values here that represent the confidence values. I'm going to use the line chart here, so it's a better example here. And also it kind of gives you a default of when you want to forecast out to. I said out to the decade. Let's go to 2030, press tab. You can see now we can see a little bit more separation of the upper and lower bounds. Now a lot of this charting takes from some of these options here. So right, we've got our population here, which is our current data, and then we've got our forecast, which is this middle line, and then we've got the lower confidence bound and the lower confidence bound and the upper confidence bound. So we had our forecast end, we had a forecast start data. This confidence interval, this is what informs those two bounds here, right? The 95% confidence interval. Now the seasonality feature here, what it could be used for if you expect some seasonality in your data, maybe winter sales or summer sales if you had sales data. This parameter is going to help you out when you have some seasonality to it. And I'll show you how that gets impacted in the other data set I'll show later on. Now this checkbox where you can include forecast statistics, and it gives some very esoteric type of forecast statistics. I'm not going to go into them, but these are values I probably won't be able to explain in any great detail. Now the timeline range, of course, is your input data, right? You've got your date timeline range, and your values range is the population data here, for example. Now this fill missing points using interpolation, this basically says if there's some missing data here, what it's going to do is either you can put zeros, or by default it chooses interpolation. And what it does here is it creates a weighted average of the data before and afterwards. The aggregate duplicates using this is our aggregation data. So if you had duplicate values, let's say for example they came back with a recount of the data and it was off by maybe a couple 100,000. And what the aggregate duplicates using average would do is, of course, it would average those two data points. Now there's also the other options of counting, max, and median, but probably the other one would be sum. So in this example, maybe you had a count where it stopped. So in that instance, maybe in October, they ended the count mid count in October, and then they started up again, but they have two data points for October first. And those data points should be summed up instead of average. So that's another example of where maybe you'd use that aggregation sum instead of average. And this data didn't have any of those instances as far as I saw. So what I'm going to do now is click create, and it's going to create a separate sheet with a table. And those values now have created this chart. Make this chart a little bit bigger. And you see, like in our first two columns, that's where it kind of informs the access and the blue line. But these other three columns, C, D, and E, are what make up the forecast values here, these lines. So the upper bound, the lower bound, which is that lower line, and the upper bound, which is the higher line there. And of course our forecast is that middle line. Now if I go further down in this chart, or in this table here, you can see that there are the values, and these values of course source the lines. If I click in one of these cells, it's an Excel formula. It's a forecast.ets formula, and this is what, when you select those options in the earlier dialog window, you have those options kind of appear, they show up, right? You have the seasonality, you have data completion, you have aggregation, and so these are the values that kind of source those lines, right? So we have forecast here. So here's the one for the lower bound, right? We have the value here minus the forecast. That gives you the lower bound. Let me go click the function arguments, and you can see here we have our confidence level here. This value, that 95%, that we selected earlier on, that shows up here. Seasonality still shows up, data completion still shows up, aggregation shows up here, and the same thing for the upper bound. Instead of minusing it, it adds it. So a lot of the choices that's selected from the dialog window are all incorporated here in the table with the formulas. So you don't really have to write these formulas. You just have a couple clicks of the button and it creates this table for you. It creates the chart for you and it makes it all easy. Now I mentioned earlier looking at seasonality data, and here's some things that you probably need to be aware of while going into that. So let's go into the search tab here and I'll go to data, forecast sheet, and we have our chart here, and you can look at and see at the seasonality data, right? These are Google search terms for the word Christmas trees. Now, of course, as you see this spike here, these are all the time periods closer in December where the spike for Christmas tree, that keyword, is in Google Trends. And we can either, again, have it in the lines or we can have it in the bar column format, but I'm gonna choose lines again. And one thing to be aware of is look how it looks at this data. We've got our upper bounds and lower bounds again. And when you think about it, there's not much search volume in the off season, right? You got these ones and twos here. And what forecast does is it looks at it too, and it does the lower bound as negative numbers. Well, when you really think about it, is there ever a negative search? No. So maybe in this time, it's good to know your data, and maybe you don't need to have this confidence interval there. Maybe you just want to have the search term. So the seasonality, you can see where it automatically detects it. Now this is detecting 52 weeks, but let's say you only wanted to change it 26 weeks, and you'll see what happens when we do that. The forecast goes a little bit off too, right? You see it goes to -20 here. So in this instance, it's probably better off to let Excel automatically detect it, and you can see it does a pretty decent job of detecting when the spikes show up in the forecast. And so if you're a salesperson and you think maybe I'll start my campaign around the end of September here this year and closer to the middle of September in the 2022. So that's what forecasting can do for you, and it'll help you plan out subsequent marketing campaigns in the next year or two. So if I click create, it does the same thing here. It creates my table here. Instead of having confidence intervals, because I deselected that, I'll just have the two values here plus my forecasting column here. So that's the way that we can use the data forecast sheet capabilities of Excel. Pretty neat feature. You don't have to go into writing that function. It does it for you and it creates the chart for you. So it's a pretty neat feature for you and pretty easy to use. And all it takes is just a couple clicks. So I hope that helps. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.